On a bright morning in London, one of the most important moments in television history was about to unfold. Paul McCartney, a musician who had spent his entire life bringing joy to millions of people around the world, walked onto the set of a popular morning talk show. He was there to discuss his new documentary, a project that celebrated his musical journey and the incredible experiences he'd had throughout his career. Everything seemed normal and ordinary at first. The studio lights were shining brightly, the crew was setting up their equipment, and the host was preparing her notes for what should have been a pleasant, cheerful conversation. The host's name was Lorraine Kelly, a well-known television personality who had built her career over many years. She was sitting across from Paul with her notes spread out on a small coffee table between them. Lorraine had practiced her warm smile for so many years that it had become completely natural to her. She knew exactly how to make guests feel welcome and comfortable. When the cameras began to roll, everything appeared to be perfectly normal. There was nothing in that moment that suggested the conversation was about to take a terrible turn. "Paul, welcome to the show," Lorraine said, her voice carrying all the practiced cheerfulness that morning television hosts perfect over decades of experience. Paul settled comfortably into his chair and smiled. "Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here," he replied politely. He seemed completely at ease, the way someone would feel when visiting an old friend. "So let's talk about this documentary of yours," Lorraine continued, glancing down at her notes. "You've had quite the career, haven't you? Though I have to say, some people might wonder if you're just trying to stay relevant at this point." There was a brief pause. Paul's warm smile faltered just slightly, but he recovered, aired quickly, and remained professional. "Well, I suppose I'm just doing what I've always done," he said calmly, "making music and sharing it with people who want to listen. That's what I love doing." But Lorraine wasn't going to let the conversation stay pleasant. She leaned back in her chair and crossed her legs, preparing to push harder. "Right. But you're what, in your 80s now? Don't you think it's time to let the younger generation have their moment? I mean, how many times can you tour the same songs?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the warm, friendly interview they had expected. This was something different, something that felt mean-spirited from the very beginning. Paul tried to stay calm and answer thoughtfully. "I tour because people still want to hear the music," he explained. "The shows sell out. Fans from all generations come together, and that's something really special." But Lorraine was determined to be confrontational. She waved her hand dismissively, as if his answer was meaningless. "Sell out? Come on now," she said with obvious sarcasm. "Let's be honest. People are coming for nostalgia, not because you're doing anything new or groundbreaking. You've been riding on the coattails of the Beatles for what, 60 years now?" Paul took a slow, deliberate breath, clearly trying to remain calm and reasonable. "The Beatles were a collaboration, a partnership," he said, his voice patient but firm. "What we created together was special, but I've also had a successful solo career. I worked with Wings, I've experimented with different genres. I've never stopped creating and trying new things." Lorraine laughed, but it wasn't a warm, friendly laugh. It was sharp and cutting, designed to hurt. "Successful solo career? That's generous," she said mockingly. "Without John Lennon, woo. Would anyone really care about what you were doing? Let's face it, he was the real genius of the group. He was the creative one who made the Beatles special." The temperature in the room seemed to drop at those words. Paul's eyes narrowed slightly, and the people watching could see that he was becoming upset. However, he still tried to keep his voice steady and reasonable. "John was incredibly talented, and I miss him every day," Paul said. "But we wrote together. We inspired each other. It wasn't about one person being better than another. We were partners." But Lorraine wasn't interested in hearing that perspective. She interrupted him immediately and flipped through her notes dramatically, as if she was about to deliver something devastating. "Oh, please," she said sharply. "Everyone knows John was the creative force. You were just the pretty face who played the bass, and not even that well, if we're being completely honest." Members of the crew standing around the set exchanged shocked glances. They could feel that the interview had crossed a line from tough questioning into something uglier and more personal. This was no longer about journalism. This was about attacking someone deliberately. Paul straightened in his chair, and his expression hardened noticeably. He was clearly very upset now, though he was still trying to maintain some control over his emotions. "I think you're being incredibly disrespectful," Paul said, his voice firm and strong. "Not just to me, but to the legacy of the band and to John's memory as well." Lorraine waved her hand again, as if she was brushing away his objection like it didn't matter at all. "Disrespectful? I'm just asking the questions everyone's thinking," she said. "You've made millions, probably billions, off songs that were written when you were young. Now you're just an old man clinging to past glory. Don't you have any shame about that? Isn't it embarrassing to keep performing the same old songs?" Paul repeated the word shame slowly, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "I'm proud of everything I've accomplished," he said, his voice quiet but filled with conviction. "I've worked hard my entire life, and I've never taken for granted the connection I have with people through music. That connection means everything to me." But Lorraine pressed on, leaning forward now and speaking with a voice dripping with contempt and condescension. "You haven't really worked, have you?" she asked scornfully. "You stumbled into success as a young man, had everything handed to you, and now you just collect checks from the same old songs. Real artists evolve. They grow. They challenge themselves. You just play yesterday for the millionth time and call it a career." Paul's hands gripped the armrests of his chair, and it was clear he was trying very hard to keep his emotions in check. "I've written hundreds of songs," he said, his voice rising slightly with frustration. "I've explored classical music, electronic music, and collaborated with artists across every single genre imaginable. If you'd done even basic research before this interview, you would know that." Lorraine smirked, showing no sign of backing down. "Oh, I did my research, Paul. I know all about your little vanity projects. The classical albums that nobody listened to, the experimental stuff that went nowhere. It's all just desperation, isn't it? Trying to prove you're more than just the guy who got lucky in a band 60 years ago." "Lucky?" Paul's voice rose more noticeably now, and the frustration was impossible to hide. "You think it was luck? We practiced for hours every single day. We played tiny clubs in Hamburg. We worked ourselves to absolute exhaustion trying to get where we were. Luck had nothing to do with it. We earned every bit of success we achieved." Lorraine showed that she had no intention of being fair or reasonable. She examined her nails as if she was bored and uninterested in what he was saying. Sure, she said dismissively. "But let's talk about your personal life, shall we? 3 marriages, was it? 4? I lose count. That's not exactly the behavior of someone with good judgment or wisdom." Paul's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "My personal relationships are none of your business," he said firmly, "and they have nothing to do with why I'm here today." But Lorraine pushed even harder, showing complete disrespect for basic professional boundaries. "Everything's my business when you sit in that chair," she shot back. "You're a public figure. You've made yourself a commodity. And frankly, the public has a right to know that behind all the nice guy image, you're just another celebrity who can't keep a marriage together and who's full of problems." "I've loved and lost like many people," Paul said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I've also found happiness and built a good life. But again, this has nothing to do with the documentary or why I'm here today." Lorraine let out that cutting laugh again, the one that seemed designed specifically to wound. "The documentary, right? A vanity project where you get to rewrite history and make yourself look like the hero of every story. Did you pay people to say nice things about you? Because I can't imagine anyone genuinely thinking you're as important as you seem to think you are." That was the breaking point. Paul stood up abruptly, and his microphone pack became tangled as he moved. "I've had enough of this," he said, his voice shaking with controlled anger. "I came here for a professional interview, not to be insulted and attacked by someone who clearly has an agenda against me." Lorraine responded with complete dismissal and disrespect. "Oh, sit down," she said rudely. "Don't be such a baby. Can't handle a few tough questions? That's pathetic and weak." Paul shook his head firmly. "These aren't tough questions," he said, his voice still shaking. "This is just cruelty disguised as journalism. You're not interested in the truth. You're interested in tearing someone down for ratings and attention." Lorraine stood as well, her face twisted with indignation and anger. "How dare you question my journalistic integrity?" she said sharply. "I've been doing this for years. I've interviewed prime ministers, movie stars, actual important people. You're just a has-been musician who should be grateful that I even agreed to have you on my show." Paul looked at her with disbelief. "Grateful? he repeated. You should be grateful. I've given decades of joy to millions of people around the world. I've contributed to culture, to art, to bringing people together through music. What have you done besides sit in a chair and belittle your guests? The crew had stopped pretending to work at this point. Everyone in the studio was frozen in place, watching this confrontation unfold with shock and dismay. Lorraine's face turned red with anger. Get out! Get out of my studio right now! She demanded loudly. I'm already leaving, Paul said calmly, pulling off his microphone pack and dropping it on the chair. I don't need to subject myself to this kind of treatment. I've faced actual challenges in my life, real hardships, and I'm not going to stand here and let you talk to me like I'm nothing or worthless. He walked toward the edge of the set, and Lorraine shouted after him one final insult. You are nothing without the Beatles, she screamed. You're a footnote in music history pretending to be a legend. But Paul stopped and turned back one more time. He had one more thing to say, and he wanted her to hear it. You know what the saddest part of all this is? He asked quietly. You could have had a lovely conversation. You could have asked about the documentary, about the stories behind the songs, about the incredible people I've worked with over the decades. Instead, you chose to be mean-spirited and small. That says everything about you and nothing about me. Lorraine was furious. Don't you dare lecture me, she snapped. I built this show from nothing. I earned my place here. And you've just thrown it all away, Paul said quietly, with sadness in his voice. Because this right here, this is what people will remember. Not your years of work, not your other interviews, just this moment where you forgot basic human decency. Lorraine crossed her arms defensively. The public will side with me. They'll see you for the entitled celebrity you really are, walking off when things get a little challenging. Paul shook his head slowly. Challenging? You called my life's work worthless. You mocked my marriages, my age, my talent. You've shown nothing but contempt from the moment I sat down. If you think that's challenging journalism, you're deluded and mistaken. Lorraine called out to someone off camera, her voice desperate. Get security. Escort this man out of here immediately. But Paul didn't wait. I'm going, he said. I don't need an escort. I know my way out perfectly well. He paused for a moment, taking one last look at Lorraine. I genuinely hope you think about what happened here today because you've hurt yourself far more than you could ever hurt me. I wish you well, truly, but I hope you learned something from this. With those final words, he walked off the set, leaving Lorraine standing alone. The studio fell into a stunned, heavy silence. Lorraine stood there with her chest heaving, clearly expecting someone to support her, to agree that she'd been right to treat Paul that way. But as she looked around, the crew members were looking at her with expressions ranging from shock to disgust and disappointment. What? She demanded loudly. What are you all staring at? Get back to work. We need to fill this segment with something else. But nobody moved. Everyone stood, frozen, unable to believe what they had witnessed. The producer, a woman in her 50s who'd worked in television for decades and had seen many things, stepped forward to speak to Lorraine. Lorraine, that was completely out of line, the producer said firmly. Way too far. Lorraine's voice pitched higher in defensiveness. Out of line? I was doing my job. I was asking the hard questions that nobody else has the courage to ask. The producer shook her head. You were bullying a guest, she said flatly and calmly. There's a real difference between tough questioning and personal attacks. You crossed that line about 5 minutes into the interview, and then you kept going and going. He's a public figure, Lorraine protested. He can handle it. That's what being famous means. The producer remained firm in her position. Being a public figure doesn't mean you forfeit basic respect and human decency, she replied. And even if it did, what you said wasn't journalism. It was just mean and hurtful. Lorraine looked around the studio desperately, searching for an ally, someone who would agree with her and support her. Can't I be the only one who thinks Paul McCartney is overrated? She asked. More silence met her question. Finally, one of the cameramen spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. My mom loves Paul McCartney, the cameraman said. She's going to be devastated when she hears about this and what happened here today. Lorraine muttered dismissively. Oh, for heaven's sake, it's just Paul McCartney. There are plenty of other musicians in the world. The cameraman didn't agree. Not like him, he said quietly. He's special and talented, and you treated him like garbage today. Lorraine spun to face the producer again. Are we going to air this interview or not? The producer was already on her phone, speaking urgently. I'm talking to the network now, the producer said. But Lorraine, I'll be honest with you, this is bad. Really, really bad. Lorraine tried to downplay it. It's just one interview. These things happen. It'll blow over. But the producer didn't agree. You called Paul McCartney talentless. You mocked his marriages, his age, and suggested he was only successful because of John Lennon. Do you really think that's going to blow over quietly? For the first time, real uncertainty flickered across Lorraine's face as she began to understand the gravity of what she had done. I was just trying to make good television, Lorraine said defensively. People love drama and conflict. The producer looked at her with disappointment. There's drama, and then there's watching someone be unnecessarily cruel to a beloved figure that people around the world care about deeply, the producer said. You've been doing this long enough to know the difference. You know what's appropriate and what crosses the line. Lorraine sank back into her chair, the reality of what had happened beginning to dawn on her slowly. He provoked me, she said weakly. Did you see how he was looking at me? He was being disrespectful. The producer spoke clearly. He was looking at you like someone who couldn't believe what he was hearing, and honestly, neither could I. What were you thinking? Why did you decide to attack him like that? Lorraine tried to explain herself. I thought it would make me look tough, like a real journalist who doesn't coddle celebrities. The producer shook her head. Instead, you look like a bully, she said bluntly and directly. And the network is already getting calls. Someone in the audience must have tweeted about it already. This is spreading fast. Lorraine's hands started to shake. What kind of calls? She asked nervously. Complaints, the producer said. Lots of them. And that's just in the last 5 minutes from the live audience members who had their phones and were able to send messages immediately. The producer's phone buzzed again, and she read the new message with a serious expression. We're pulling the segment. It won't air on television, the producer said firmly. Lorraine protested immediately. You can't do that. That's my show, and I have a right to say what happens on it. The producer corrected her. That's the network's show, and it's their reputation on the line, the producer countered. They're not going to broadcast footage of you attacking Paul McCartney on live television. The backlash would be enormous and devastating to the network's reputation. Lorraine stood up and began pacing back and forth across the studio floor. This is ridiculous, she said. I've had controversial interviews before. Nobody made this big of a deal about it or reacted this way. The producer explained the difference clearly. Because those interviews were with people who actually deserved tough questioning. Politicians who'd been caught in scandals, celebrities accused of serious wrongdoing. Paul McCartney came here to talk about a documentary about his music career. There was no scandal, no controversy, nothing that warranted what you did. You created a situation that didn't exist. Lorraine asked quietly, So, what happens now? The producer looked at her phone again, reading a new message that had just come in. The network wants to see you immediately, the producer said. Lorraine felt her stomach drop completely. They're going to fire me, aren't they? She asked, though she already knew the answer deep down. The producer looked at her sympathetically. I don't know for certain, but I wouldn't want to be in your position right now, she said gently. For what it's worth, Lorraine, you're a talented broadcaster. You've done great work over the years. But today, you forgot the basic rule of interviewing. Treat your guests with respect, especially when you're asking difficult questions. Respect is the foundation of GOS. But journalism? I just wanted to be memorable, Lorraine said quietly, admitting the truth to herself. The producer nodded. Well, you succeeded, but not in the way you hoped for or wanted. You're memorable now, but for the wrong reasons entirely. The studio began to clear out as crew members gathered their equipment and prepared to leave. Everyone was avoiding eye contact with Lorraine, making the scene even more painful and isolating for her. She stood alone in the middle of the set, the bright light still shining down on her, illuminating the empty chair where Paul McCartney had sat just minutes before. This was supposed to be a good day, she whispered to no one in particular. This was supposed to go differently. But it hadn't. This was the day Lorraine Kelly let her ego and her need for sensationalism override her professionalism. This was the day she mistook cruelty for courage and paid a significant price for that mistake. As she walked slowly toward the exit, heading to face the network executives who were surely very angry with her, she couldn't help but replay the interview in her mind, seeing now, too late, all the moments where she could have made a different choice. Meanwhile, Paul McCartney had left the building. He'd been ushered out by apologetic staff members, people who'd grown up listening to his music and were mortified by what had happened in that studio. They offered him coffee, a quiet room to decompress and collect himself, anything he needed to feel better. He politely declined all of it, thanked them sincerely for their kindness, and headed to his car with dignity. Sitting in the back seat as his driver navigated through London traffic, Paul looked out the window at the city he'd known for so many decades. He felt tired, but not from the confrontation itself. He felt tired from the reminder that even after all these years, even after all he'd accomplished and all the joy he'd brought to people, there were still people who felt the need to tear him down and attack him. But he also felt something else as well. He felt relief. Relief that he'd stood up for himself, that he hadn't just sat there quietly and taken the abuse without responding. Relief that he'd recognized the situation for what it was, and removed himself from it before things got even worse. There was dignity in that, he thought. There was real strength in knowing when to walk away from a situation that was poisonous and wrong. His phone buzzed with messages from his manager, his publicist, and friends who'd already heard what happened. The story was spreading fast, just as the producer had predicted it would. But Paul wasn't worried about what people would think or say. He knew the truth of what had happened in that studio. He knew that anyone who watched the footage, if it ever got released, would see exactly who had been unreasonable and cruel. His driver caught his eye in the rearview mirror and asked, "You all right, Paul?" Paul managed a small smile. "Yeah, I'm all right. Just another day in the life, I suppose." The driver chuckled. "I heard what happened. My sister works at the studio. She said you were a complete gentleman throughout." Paul nodded. "I tried to be. Though I'll admit I lost my temper a bit at the end there." The driver responded, "Sounds like she deserved it. Begging your pardon for saying so, but she did." Paul didn't respond to that comment. He didn't want to badmouth Lorraine, even after everything that had happened. It wasn't in his nature or his character to be that way. Instead, he thought about the documentary, the reason he'd agreed to the interview in the first place. It was a celebration of music, of collaboration between artists, of the joy that creating art had brought to his life over many decades. That was what really mattered and what was important. Not one hostile interview with one television host would let her own issues and insecurities cloud her judgment and professional behavior. As he looked out at the London streets, Paul felt a sense of peace settle over him. He would move forward, just as he always had. Back at the studio, Lorraine was sitting in a conference room facing 3 serious network executives. Their expressions were very grim and showed they were not happy with her. "Do you understand the gravity of what happened today?" one of them asked formally. Lorraine nodded, her earlier defiance completely gone and replaced with shame. "I do. I made a mistake." The executive repeated the words sarcastically. "A mistake? You verbally attacked one of the most beloved musicians in the world on live television. Our phones haven't stopped ringing since it happened. Social media is exploding with comments and criticism. This isn't just a mistake, Lorraine. This is a disaster of massive proportions." "I know," Lorraine said, her voice barely above a whisper, filled with regret. "I don't know what came over me. I just kept pushing and pushing, and I couldn't seem to stop myself." The third executive leaned forward, trying to understand her thinking. "We need to know why. Why Paul McCartney? Why today? What were you hoping to achieve with this approach?" Lorraine thought about the question for a long moment, really examining her own motivations and feelings honestly. "I think I wanted to prove I was still relevant," she admitted quietly. "I wanted to create moments that people would talk about and remember me for, but I went about it completely the wrong way." The first executive nodded. "Yes, you did, and now we have to decide what to do about it and how to handle this situation." The room fell completely silent. Lorraine felt tears prickling at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had created this mess through her own choices. She had to face the consequences with whatever dignity she had left. After a tense silence, the second execu. Tive finally spoke. "We're suspending the show," he said. "We need time to assess the damage and figure out if there's any way to salvage this situation or if it's beyond repair." Lorraine asked the question she already knew the answer to. "And me? What happens to me?" The third executive chose his words carefully. "We'll be in touch about that," he said, which everyone in the room understood was corporate speak for your career here is probably over, but we need to work out the details. Lorraine stood on shaky legs. "For what it's worth, I am truly sorry. Not just for the damage to the network, but for how I treated Mr. McCartney. He deserved better than that from me." The executives didn't respond. Lorraine left the room slowly and walked through the hallways of the building where she'd worked for so many years, feeling completely numb and disconnected from reality. She stepped out into the afternoon sunshine and asked herself how it had all gone so wrong so quickly. The answer, she knew, was that it hadn't been quick at all. It had been building for a while, this need inside her to be more than she was, to create controversy where none existed, to mistake aggression for real assertiveness. She had let her insecurities drive her behavior in destructive ways, and now she was paying a heavy price for those choices. Across town, Paul McCartney was in his home studio, holding a guitar in his hands. Music had always been his refuge, his way of processing the world and making sense of his experiences. His fingers found familiar chords, and he began to play a simple melody, letting the music flow through him the way it always had. This was who he really was at his core, not the target of someone's misplaced anger, not a has-been clinging to past glory, but a musician who'd spent his entire life creating beauty and sharing it with the world. That was his legacy. That was what mattered and what would endure. No one, no matter how hard they tried, could take that away from him or diminish it. As evening fell over London, two very different people contemplated the same event from very different perspectives and with very different feelings. One had stood firm in the face of cruelty and walked away with his dignity completely intact and his spirit undamaged. The other had let her worst impulses control her and lost everything she'd worked for in just 39 seconds of pure contempt and meanness. It was a powerful reminder that words have real power, that how we treat others matters deeply, and that sometimes the person we hurt most with our cruelty is ourselves. Lorraine Kelly had learned that painful lesson the hard way, in front of cameras and witnesses, with no way to take back what she had said or undo what she had done. All she could do now was live with the consequences and hope that somehow, someday, she might find a way to make amends and move forward with her life. But Paul McCartney didn't need her amends or apologies. He had his music, his family, his devoted fans around the world, and a lifetime of memories and accomplishments that no interview could diminish or take away. He'd faced far greater challenges than one hostile television host and had come through them all with grace. This was just another bump in a very long road. And like all the others, he would move past it and keep creating, keep playing, keep being exactly who he had always been. A musician, an artist, a legend.